The galaxy was quiet for the first time in 200 years. The kind of quiet that comes after a terrible storm has passed, leaving only broken pieces behind. The Great War between the Zephyr Empire and the Crimson Federation had finally ended, not with victory parades or celebrations, but with exhausted silence. Both sides had simply run out of things to fight with, and people willing to die. Commander Kang Subin stood at the observation window of the human starship Soul Explorer, watching the stars that had witnessed so much death and destruction. Her reflection stared back at her from the thick glass. A woman in her 30s with tired eyes that had seen too many reports about the galactic conflict that humanity could only watch. From far away, Earth had been building its first real spaceships while entire solar systems burned in the distance. The war had been brutal beyond imagination. Planets cracked like eggs under orbital bombardment. Entire species wiped out because they happened to live in contested space trade routes that had connected civilizations for thousands of years, became graveyards of twisted metal and frozen bodies. The Zephyr Empire, with their crystal ships and energy weapons, had fought the Crimson Federation with their biomechanical fleets and living ships until both sides collapsed from sheer exhaustion. Dr. Yoon Jae-sung approached Subin, carrying a datapad filled with the latest intelligence reports about the post-war galaxy. His face showed the excitement of a scientist about to make history, mixed with the sadness of someone who understood what they were walking into. The galaxy they had dreamed of joining was nothing like what they had imagined. "We are seeing refugee ships everywhere," he said quietly, pointing to the scanner readings. "Millions of beings with nowhere to go. Their homeworlds are gone or too damaged to support life. The major powers cannot even take care of their own people, let alone help others." Subin nodded as she read through the reports. The numbers were staggering. 43 billion refugees scattered across space, living in converted cargo ships, makeshift stations, and anywhere else they could find shelter. The lucky ones had found planets that could support their biology. The unlucky ones were slowly dying in ships that were never meant to be permanent homes. The Soul Explorer was part of humanity's first deep space fleet. 12 ships carrying diplomats, scientists, engineers, and supplies. Everything Earth could spare for this historic mission. Captain Lee Dong-wook commanded the escort vessel Busan Guardian, while engineer Park Hae-jin led the technical teams aboard the supply ship Gwangju Hope. They had prepared for first contact with advanced alien civilizations, not for disaster relief on a galactic scale. The human ships were small compared to the massive warships that had fought in the Great Conflict, but they were built with something the galaxy had forgotten how to value: reliability and efficiency. While alien empires had focused on building bigger weapons and stronger shields, humans had learned to make ships that could travel far and work for a long time without breaking down. Their first encounter with galactic civilization came 3 days after entering what had once been Zephyr territory. A distress signal led them to a convoy of refugee ships drifting near a dead star system. The vessels were a sorry sight: patched hull plating, mismatched engines, and life support systems held together more by hope than by proper engineering. The lead ship identified itself as carrying Keelan refugees, 4 armed beings whose industrial homeworld had been strip-mined for war materials. Another vessel held Vorthak, families gas-breathing creatures whose atmospheric processors had been destroyed in the fighting. A third ship was packed with Nexari, a hive mind species that communicated through pheromones and had been scattered when their queen ships were targeted. By both sides, Captain Oh Seung-hwan established communication with the refugee convoy, expecting the usual protocols of identification, territorial claims, and defensive posturing. Instead, he heard something that broke his heart. Desperate voices asking, not for protection or resources, but simply to be left alone. They had learned that contact with any military force usually meant more suffering. Subin made a decision that would echo across the galaxy. She ordered all human ships to provide immediate assistance without asking for anything in return. Medical teams led by Dr. Song Min-ho transferred to the refugee vessels, carrying supplies and expertise. Human engineers worked alongside alien technicians to repair damaged systems, while translators struggled to communicate across dozens of different languages and cultural barriers. The refugees could not believe what they were seeing. These strange new beings with only 2 arms and basic technology were helping them without demanding payment. tribute, or territory. The humans shared their food rations even though they were far from resupply. They offered medical care to species they had never encountered before. And most shocking of all, they seemed genuinely interested in learning about refugee cultures and traditions. Word spread quickly through the underground networks that connected survivor communities across the galaxy. The stories seemed impossible. A new species that treated all beings as equals, that shared technology freely, that seemed more interested in cooperation than conquest. Many dismissed these tales as desperate fantasies, but the evidence kept mounting. The humans established their first aid station at Meridian Point, an abandoned trading post that had been neutral ground before the war. Captain Nam Ji-woo converted the derelict facility into a bustling hub, where beings from across the galaxy could find food, medical care, and something even more precious, hope. The humans did not claim ownership of the station or demand tribute. They simply invited everyone to help rebuild it together. Engineer Bayman Seok worked 18-hour shifts, teaching human repair techniques to alien technicians who had forgotten that different species could work. Together, his enthusiasm was infectious. Soon, Keelan engineers were collaborating with Vorthak atmospheric specialists, while Nixari drones coordinated supply distribution with an efficiency that amazed everyone. The formal powers of the galaxy finally took notice when their spies reported impossible scenes. Different species working side by side, sharing resources and knowledge. Species that had been enemies during the war were cooperating on joint projects. The humans had not conquered anyone or claimed any territory, but they were changing the fundamental rules of how galactic civilization operated. Both the Zephyr Empire and Crimson Federation sent investigation teams to study these newcomers. What they found disturbed them more than any weapon could have. The humans were militarily weak. Their ships carried outdated weapons, their armor was primitive by galactic standards, and their numbers were laughably small. But they possessed something both empires had lost during the long war: the ability to inspire trust in others. High Regent Vextel of the Zephyr Empire reviewed the reports with growing unease. His people had ruled through technological superiority and carefully maintained fear. Now these humans were showing that cooperation could achieve more than domination. War Marshal Kryn of the Crimson Federation had similar concerns. Her military traditions emphasized strength through unity within their own species. But the humans were creating unity across species. The intelligence reports painted a picture that challenged everything the galactic powers thought they knew about civilization. The humans mediated disputes between refugee groups without favoring either side. They established trade routes through dangerous space and invited all species to use them freely. They shared scientific discoveries that could have given them advantages over potential enemies. Dr. Choi So Young led cultural exchange programs that brought together beings who had not spoken peacefully in generations. Her patience and genuine curiosity broke down barriers that centuries of war had created. Young Keelan and Vorthak were learning each other's languages. Nexari drones were teaching human children about collective consciousness, while human artists showed alien audiences how individual creativity could create beauty. The transformation was slow, but undeniable. Refugee camps became permanent settlements as different species chose to stay together. Trade began, flowing along routes that had been abandoned for decades. Research stations welcomed scientists from former enemy civilizations who found they could accomplish more together than they ever had in isolation. Su Bin received regular reports about these changes as the human fleet continued its mission. Each success story was balanced by reminders of how much work remained to be done. The galaxy was still broken, still divided by centuries of hatred and mistrust. But for the first time since the war began, there were signs that healing was possible. The breakthrough moment came when a mixed convoy of human and refugee ships encountered pirates near the Kepler system. These were not ordinary criminals, but deserters from both major fleets, who had kept their military equipment when they abandoned their posts. They had been raiding with impunity because no one wanted to waste resources, protecting neutral shipping. What happened next would become legend throughout the galaxy. The human escort ships were outnumbered 3-1, but they did not retreat or abandon the civilians they were protecting. Instead, they coordinated with any refugee ships that had defensive capabilities, creating an improvised fleet that fought as one. Unit Keelan fighters provided reconnaissance, while Vorthak ships used their atmospheric manipulation systems to confuse enemy sensors. Nexari vessels shared targeting data through there. The formal invitation arrived at Meridian Station exactly 3 weeks after the pirate battle that had sent shockwaves across the galaxy. Ambassador Kim Tae-hyun held the crystalline message disc in his hands, reading the carefully worded request. For the third time, the Galactic Council wanted to meet with human representatives, something that had not happened with any new species in over 200 years. The message itself was a masterwork of diplomatic language that managed to sound both welcoming and threatening at the same time. Representatives of the surviving galactic powers cordially invited human delegates to attend a formal session to discuss matters of mutual interest and concern. Translation: the major empires wanted to figure out what these troublesome newcomers were planning before they caused more disruption. Kim had spent his entire career preparing for this moment, but nothing in his training had covered making first contact with civilizations that had just finished destroying each other. The standard protocols assumed he would be dealing with stable governments, not the exhausted remnants of empires that had bled themselves nearly to death. Dr. Choi So Young joined him in the communications center carrying datapads filled with intelligence about what remained of galactic politics. Her research painted a disturbing picture of civilizations that had forgotten how to function without conflict. The Great War had lasted so long that entire generations had grown up knowing nothing but violence and suspicion. We are walking into a situation where trust is considered a weakness, she warned, as they began preparations for the journey. Every conversation will be evaluated for hidden meanings. Every gesture will be analyzed for tactical advantage. They have been fighting so long they have forgotten how to do anything else. The human delegation would be small, just Kim as chief diplomat, Choi as cultural specialist, and a technical team led by engineer Park Hae-jin. Their ship, the diplomatic vessel Soul Harmony, carried no weapons and minimal defensive systems. Earth wanted to make it clear that humans came in peace, even if that peace might be mistaken for weakness. The journey to Nexus Prime took 6 days through space that bore the scars of centuries of warfare. Entire star systems showed evidence of strip mining where desperate empires had consumed their own resources to feed the war machine. Debris fields marked the locations of major fleet battles, some so large they created navigation hazards for passing ships. What shocked the human crew most was the emptiness. Between the dead systems and debris fields were vast regions where nothing moved at all. Trade routes that had once connected thriving civilizations were now empty corridors, haunted only by automated distress beacons from long-dead ships. The galaxy had not just been at war, it had been dying. Nexus Prime appeared on their sensors as a massive construct that dwarfed anything humans had ever built. The ancient space station had once been the crown jewel of galactic civilization, where beings from thousands of worlds came to trade knowledge and celebrate diversity. Now it looked like a wounded giant with entire sections dark and lifeless. The human ship was directed to Docking Bay 743, a maintenance facility far from the diplomatic quarters usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. Even this small insult carried meaning. Kim and his team were not being received as equals, but as subjects to be examined and judged. The escort that met them consisted entirely of armed security personnel, rather than the cultural attachés who traditionally welcomed new species to the galactic community. The guards were a mix of species that Kim recognized from intelligence reports: Zephyr crystal beings whose bodies reflected light and patterns of barely contained hostility, and Crimson Federation bio-warriors, whose predatory features showed the kind of wariness that came from surviving too many betrayals. The route to the council chambers took them through sections of the station that told the story of galactic decline better than any report. Markets that should have bustled with merchants from across known space were empty and dark. Cultural centers where different species had once celebrated their diversity were sealed behind security barriers. The council chamber itself was a monument to loss. Half the seats designed to represent hundreds of worlds and species sat empty. Their former occupants dead missing or representing governments that no longer existed. The surviving delegates had arranged themselves in defensive clusters maintaining the bitter divisions that the war had created rather than dissolved. High Regent Vextal spoke for what remained of the Zephyr Empire. His towering crystalline form created light patterns that human translators had learned to interpret as deep suspicion mixed with barely controlled fear. The Zephyr had once ruled nearly a quarter of the galaxy through technological superiority and careful alliances. Now they controlled perhaps 20 systems and spent most of their resources fighting rebellions and warlords' war. Marshal Kryn represented the Crimson Federation, and everything about her spoke of someone who had survived by being more dangerous than her enemies. Her biomechanical armor showed repair scars from dozens of battles, while her enhanced predatory features remained constantly alert. The Federation had maintained better internal cohesion than their enemies, but their economy had collapsed, leaving them strong in military terms, but weak in everything else. The smaller powers occupied the remaining seats with representatives who had learned that survival meant being extremely careful about every word and gesture. The 4 armed Keelan delegation sat ready to leave at the first sign of trouble. The gas-breathing Vorthak had positioned themselves near emergency exits, their atmospheric suits creating small clouds that betrayed their nervousness. Kim rose to address the assembly, using protocols that Dr. Choi had rehearsed with him dozens of times. He spoke slowly and clearly in the simplified, galactic common language that had evolved during the war years when temporary allies needed to coordinate military operations without revealing strategic information. Honored representatives of the galactic community, he began, humanity comes before you in the spirit of peaceful cooperation. We seek membership in the galactic family not as conquerors or competitors, but as partners committed to the welfare of all intelligent life. The response was immediate and exactly what they had expected. Every major power began probing for weaknesses and hidden agendas. High Regent Vextal offered exclusive mining rights to asteroid fields that intelligence reports indicated were actually contested territories. War Marshal Kryn proposed military alliance treaties that would essentially make Earth a client state of the Crimson Federation. Trade agreements were suggested that heavily favored the galactic powers while offering Earth minimal benefits. Technology exchanges were proposed that would give the empires access to human innovations, while providing outdated systems. In return, cultural exchange programs were offered that would function primarily as intelligence-gathering operations, to the amazement of every delegate present. Kim politely declined every offer that would benefit only humanity, while expressing genuine interest in proposals that could help multiple species. He suggested joint research projects to develop better agricultural techniques for worlds damaged by the war. He offered to share human medical knowledge in exchange for cultural understanding that could help different species work together more effectively. The confusion in the chamber was almost tangible. Beings who had spent centuries assuming that intelligent life was fundamentally competitive were confronted with proposals that seemed designed to benefit everyone. War Marshal Kryn leaned forward in her seat. Her enhanced senses focused entirely on the human delegation. Ambassador Kim, she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from commanding armies. Are you seriously telling this council that your species has traveled across interstellar space simply to help others? That you seek no territorial expansion? No exclusive access to resources? No strategic advantages of any kind? Kim smiled with the patience of someone who had expected exactly this question. Our strategic goal, Marshall, is both simple and profound. We want to live in a galaxy where different forms of intelligent life can cooperate productively. We believe that such cooperation benefits everyone, including humanity. High Regent Vextal created light patterns that indicated deep skepticism bordering on disbelief. Your species currently controls how many star systems, Ambassador? Just one, Regent Vextal. Kim replied calmly. Our home system of Sol. We have established no colonies, claimed no territories beyond our own solar system, and have no desire to conquer or control other worlds. The silence that followed this admission was deafening. A species that controlled exactly one star system was making proposals that could fundamentally alter the balance of power across the entire galaxy. It was either incredible naivety or something that none of the assembled powers had any experience dealing with. The testing began in earnest over the following days. Human delegates were offered opportunities that would reveal their true nature, if they were simply better at hiding selfish motivations. Military contracts were proposed assuming that their primitive-looking technology concealed advanced capabilities. Access to classified information about strategic resources was offered to test whether they could be corrupted by promises of wealth and power. Each test produced the same baffling result: polite interest followed by alternative suggestions that focused on mutual benefit rather than competitive advantage when offered E. The Deep Space Monitoring Station at Sector 7 had been transmitting the same automated warning for 18 hours before anyone realized what they were seeing. Captain Oh Seung-hwan was the first human to analyze the sensor data, working alongside Dr. Park Jin-woo and a mixed team of scientists from species that had been enemies just months before. The readings were impossible to ignore and terrifying in their implications. The massive objects approaching from intergalactic space were not asteroids or rogue planets. They were ships, thousands of them arranged in perfect geometric formations that spoke of intelligence, purpose, and overwhelming military power. The fleet was still 6 months away from the galactic rim, but long-range sensors could already detect energy signatures that dwarfed anything in the known databases. Dr. Song Min-ho ran the calculations 3 times, hoping his math was wrong. Each result confirmed what everyone feared. The approaching armada contained at least 12,000 vessels, many of them larger than anything the Zephyr Empire or Crimson Federation had ever built. Even at the height of their power before the Great War began, neither civilization could have fielded a fleet a fraction of this size. The beings piloting these ships called themselves the Void Touched, and they had been watching the galactic war from the darkness between stars. They had waited patiently for the perfect moment to strike when the galaxy's defenders were exhausted, divided, and too weak to resist effectively. What they had not expected was to find broken civilizations beginning to heal under human influence. Emergency sessions of the Galactic Council took on desperate urgency as the approaching threat became undeniable. High Regent Vex Tal and War Marshal Kryn found themselves forced to share classified military intelligence with species they had been fighting for centuries. The numbers were stark and unforgiving. The combined remaining fleets of all galactic powers could muster perhaps 1,800 battle-ready ships. The Void Touched were bringing more than 6 times that number. The intelligence reports painted a picture of an enemy unlike anything the galaxy had faced before. The Void-Touched ships seemed to be partially organic, growing and adapting rather than simply being built. Their weapons could phase through conventional energy shields. Their tactics suggested a hive-mind intelligence that coordinated movements with perfect precision across thousands of vessels simultaneously. Commander Kang Soo-bin studied the tactical data with growing dread. The human fleet consisted of exactly 37 ships, most of them converted civilian vessels with basic defensive systems. Earth had sent everything they could spare, but it was laughably inadequate compared to what was approaching. Even the mighty warships that had fought in the Great War looked like toys compared to the Void Touched dreadnoughts. The first Emergency War Council meeting was a disaster. Representatives from major powers spent more time arguing about old grievances than planning defense strategies. The Zephyr delegation insisted on command authority based on their superior technology. The Crimson Federation demanded leadership roles based on their military experience. Smaller species representatives were ignored or openly dismissed by both major powers. Kim Tae-hyun watched the proceedings with growing frustration. These beings were about to face extinction, and they were still playing political games that had caused the very war that weakened them. The humans made an offer that stunned even their closest allies. Commander Kong volunteered to coordinate unified defense, despite having the smallest and least advanced fleet in the galaxy. The silence that followed this proposal was profound. War Marshal Kryn was the first to speak, her scarred features showing disbelief mixed with anger. "You seriously propose that? We place our fleets under the command of a species that controls 1 star system and fields fewer than 40 ships." Kim stood slowly, choosing his words carefully. "We propose coordination, not command marshal. The humans are the only ones that all other species have learned to trust. Trust will be essential for the kind of cooperation needed to survive what is coming." Hi. Regent Vextal created light patterns that indicated deep skepticism. Your species has been in space for less than 1 year. You have never fought a major space battle. You know nothing of coordinating fleets across multiple star systems. What makes you think you can succeed where experienced military leaders might fail? Dr. Choi, so young, stepped forward with data, pads containing analysis that had taken weeks to compile. Regent, our psychologists have studied the command structures of every major fleet. We have identified patterns of miscommunication, territorial disputes, and conflicting objectives that have plagued galactic military operations for centuries. She activated a holographic display showing battle formations from the recent war. Your forces fight as separate armies that happen to be pointed in the same direction. Our forces fight as integrated units where each ship supports every other ship. The difference in effectiveness is measurable and significant. The debate continued for hours, with representatives arguing about chain of command, resource allocation, and strategic priorities. Meanwhile, the Void-touched fleet continued its relentless approach, gaining speed as it passed through the outer darkness. The enemy would arrive in 5 months, and the galaxy was still arguing about who should be in charge of the defense. The breakthrough came when the Keelan delegate stood to address the assembly. Her forearms gestured in patterns that indicated both respect and determination. My people have worked with humans for 4 months. We have seen how they coordinate different species in joint operations. They do not command by giving orders, they lead by making everyone stronger together. She activated her own holographic display showing recent convoy escort missions. Human ships integration with refugee defense forces had created fighting units that performed far beyond the sum of their individual capabilities. Mixed crews were becoming standard practice in human-led operations, with species that had never cooperated before, working as seamless teams. The Vorthak representative added his support through translated atmospheric chemical signals. Human engineering teams had helped his people rebuild their gas processing facilities, destroyed during the war. More importantly, they had trained Vorthak technicians to work alongside, solid matter being something that had been considered impossible before human arrival. Even the Nexari hive mind spoke in favor of human coordination. Their quantum communication networks had been integrated with human tactical systems, creating information-sharing capabilities that no single species could achieve alone. The results had been remarkable improvements in efficiency and effectiveness across all joint operations. Admiral Park Kyung-soo took command of the human contribution to the defense preparations, all 37 ships that Earth could spare. She immediately began implementing integration protocols that had been developed during convoy escort missions. Human vessels were paired with alien ships, creating mixed squadrons that combined different technologies and capabilities. The preparation time was measured in weeks, not months. Engineer Bae Min-seok worked around the clock to standardize communication protocols between technologies that had never been designed to work together. Translator Shin Yoon-ji established crash courses in tactical coordination for mixed-species crews. Cultural barriers that had seemed insurmountable just months before were dissolving under the pressure of shared necessity. The breakthrough in mixed crew integration came when Lieutenant Nam Ji-woo suggested something that would have been unthinkable before the war ended: putting crew members from different species on individual ships. The idea terrified most commanders, but the humans were willing to try anything. Soon Keelan engineers were working alongside human technicians. Vorthak navigators were coordinating with Nexari communications specialists. The first mixed crew exercises revealed both problems and possibilities. Keelan technical precision combined beautifully with human adaptability. Vorthak spatial awareness enhanced Nexari collective coordination. But cultural misunderstandings created dangerous delays and sometimes complete communication breakdowns. Training programs had to be developed and implemented in just weeks. Dr. Yoon Jae-sung established psychological support teams to help crew members overcome centuries of ingrained suspicion and fear. Many beings had never been in close contact with former enemies. Some species had biological reactions to the presence of others that had to be medically managed. The integration process was as much about healing old wounds as about military preparation. The first engagement with Void-touched scouts occurred 3 months before the main fleet was expected to arrive. Captain Lee Dong-wook led a mixed squadron to investigate strange energy readings near the galactic rim. What they found changed everything they thought they knew about the approaching enemy. The scout ships were unlike anything in galactic databases, organic-looking vessels that seemed to adapt their defenses in real time, weapons that could phase through conventional shields, tactics that suggested the ships were extensions of a single controlling intelligence rather than individual vessels with separate crews. Lee battle group scored the first victory against void-touched forces, but the cost was devastating. Of the 15 ships in his formation, only 6 survived the encounter. The enemy had capabilities that conventional tactics could not address. Their hive mind coordination made traditional fleet maneuvers predictable and useless. The Battle of the Galactic Rim began at exactly 0347 Standard Time. When the first wave of void-touched dreadnoughts crossed into known space, Admiral Park Kyung-soo watched from the bridge of the command ship, soul rising as enemy formations that, stretched across light years, moved with perfect coordination toward the waiting Allied fleet. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. 12,000 alien vessels advancing like a living thing made of metal and malice. The unified defense fleet had taken position near the Kepler Gate, a natural choke point where gravitational anomalies would force the enemy into predictable approach vectors. 1,800 ships from 17 different species waited in formations that would have been impossible just months before human vessels integrated with Zephyr crystal ships. Crimson biomechanical cruisers flew alongside Keelan industrial platforms, while Vorthak atmospheric processors provided mobile cover for fragile Nixari Scout. Ship's commander Kang Soo-bin coordinated communications from the tactical center established on Meridian Station. Her team included Lieutenant Colonel Bae Soo-mi, managing 17 different command languages, Chief Engineer Kwon Dong-hyun, monitoring, fleet-wide technical systems and cultural liaison Dr. Song, who was helping mixed crews overcome last-minute coordination problems. The enemy approached with the confidence of conquerors who had never been seriously challenged. Their formations were perfect geometric shapes that spoke of mathematical precision and overwhelming firepower. Scout reports indicated that individual void-touched vessels were larger and more heavily armed than entire squadrons of galactic ships. The size difference was so extreme it seemed impossible that the defenders could inflict meaningful damage. High Regent Vex Tal transmitted from his flagship Crystal Throne, his light patterns visible even through the communication screen. The Zephyr have faced impossible odds before Admiral Park, but never against an enemy that thinks as one mind. Our individual ship commanders will be outmaneuvered before they can react. War Marshal Kryn responded from the Crimson Dreadnought, blood honor, her scarred features grim, but determined. My people have learned to fight as pack hunters, but this enemy moves like a single predator, larger than anything we have ever faced. Traditional tactics will be useless against such coordination. Admiral Park studied the tactical displays showing both fleets approaching the engagement zone. The humans had spent weeks developing battle plans based on one critical insight. The void-touched hive mind was designed to counter organized resistance, but it could not process genuine chaos. Mixed formations of unpredictable composition, fighting with deliberately inconsistent tactics might confuse the enemy long enough to exploit their weaknesses. The first contact came when void-touched scouts engaged the outer picket line. Captain Oh Seung-hwan led a mixed squadron of human Keelan and Vorthak ships against enemy vessels that adapted their defenses in real time. The Allied ships fought with coordination that seemed random, but was actually carefully choreographed chaos. Human unpredictability combined with alien precision created tactical situations the enemy hive mind could not anticipate. Lieutenant Lim Yu-jin piloted her fighter through formations that changed every few seconds, sometimes flying with Keelan precision, sometimes with Vorthak intuition, sometimes with purely human improvisation. Her wingmen included beings she could barely communicate with, but somehow they moved together like dancers following music. Only they could hear. The breakthrough moment came when Engineer Chief Choi Woo-bin discovered something unexpected about void-touch technology. The enemy ships were not just partially organic, they were actually grown rather than built. Their hive mind connection was maintained through biological, neural networks that could be disrupted by specific energy frequencies. Dr. Park Jin-woo worked frantically to analyze the captured data from previous encounters, while the battle raged around them. His mixed species research team included Nexari, quantum specialists, Zephyr crystal resonance experts, and Crimson biomechanical engineers. Species that had been enemies were now sharing their most advanced scientific knowledge to save everyone. The enemy main fleet reached engagement range with formations that filled the entire sensor display. Each void-touched dreadnought was accompanied by hundreds of smaller vessels, creating attack groups that moved with perfect unity. The mathematical precision of their movements was beautiful and horrible, like watching a symphony of destruction performed by an orchestra of nightmares. Admiral Park gave the order that would determine the fate of galactic civilization. All ships execute Chaos Protocol. 7. Begin random engagement patterns. On my mark. The unified fleet dissolved into what appeared to be complete disorder as ships broke formation and began fighting with no apparent coordination. What actually happened was the most complex military maneuver in galactic history. 1,800 ships from 17 species began fighting as individuals, while maintaining hidden coordination through quantum encrypted channels. Each ship captain was given broad objectives but complete freedom to achieve them, however they thought best. The void touched hive mind tried to process what it was seeing and failed. Individual enemy vessels were acting in ways that made no logical sense. Human ships were charging directly at superior forces. Keelan vessels were abandoning defensive positions to support unrelated units. Vorthak atmospheric processors were using their systems in ways that had never been recorded in any database. Captain Lee Dong-wook found himself fighting alongside a Crimson bioship and 2 Nexari scouts against a void-touched heavy cruiser. The enemy vessel adapted its defenses to counter his weapons, then immediately had to readapt when the bioship attacked with living projectiles, then readapted again when the Nexari hit it with quantum disruption beams. The EIB. Constant adaptation became the enemy's weakness. When the void-touched ships tried to counter one type of attack, they became vulnerable to completely different approaches. The hive mind could not maintain effective defenses against tactics that changed faster than it could process information. Engineer Bae Min Seok transmitted the breakthrough discovery to all allied ships. The enemy neural networks operate on specific frequencies. If we can generate harmonic interference, we can disrupt their coordination temporarily. All mixed crews begin random frequency modulation of your communication systems. The effect was immediate and devastating. Void touched formations that had moved with perfect precision began to show gaps and hesitations. Individual enemy ships started making tactical errors as their connection to the hive mind fluctuated. Mixed allied crews took advantage of every moment of confusion, striking at enemy weaknesses before the connections could be re-established. The tide of battle began to turn when squadron leader Ryu Hyun-woo led a desperate attack on the enemy command cluster. Deep in the heart of the void touched formation, massive vessels served as neural relay stations maintaining the hive mind connection across the entire fleet. If those ships could be destroyed, the enemy would lose their greatest advantage. 12 human fighters escorted by volunteers from 6 different species punched through enemy defenses that should have been impenetrable. They lost ship after ship to weapons that could destroy matter at the molecular level, but kept fighting with determination that amazed their alien allies. Lieutenant Commander Yang Seo-jin watched her squadron mates die one by one as they fought their way toward the command ships. Her own fighter was held together more by hope than structural integrity, but she kept flying because the alternative was unthinkable. The galaxy was depending on them to succeed. The final assault came down to 3 ships against a command vessel the size of a small moon. Ryu Hyun-woo himself delivered the decisive blow, ramming his damaged fighter into the neural relay core at the moment when Allied fire had weakened the enemy shields. The explosion that followed could be seen across the entire battlefield. Without their central coordination, the void touched fleet began to fall apart. Ships that had moved as one mind became individual vessels that could not communicate effectively. The hive-mind connection that had been their greatest strength became a critical vulnerability when it was severed. The Allied fleet pressed their advantage, driving confused enemy formations back toward the galactic rim. Mixed crews that had learned to fight together destroyed, enemy ships that could no longer coordinate their defenses. The Battle of the Galactic Rim ended not with a single decisive moment, but with the gradual collapse of enemy resistance as the last void-touched vessels retreated into the darkness between. Galaxy's Admiral Park stood in the command center surrounded by beings from across known space. They had done something unprecedented, not just defeating a superior enemy but creating a new kind of civilization based on cooperation, rather than conquest. The cost had been terrible. Over 400 Allied ships had been lost, including half the human fleet. But the galaxy had been saved, and more importantly, it had been united in ways that the Great War had made impossible. The species that had spent centuries trying to destroy each other had instead saved each other. Commander Kang looked at the casualty reports with mixed emotions. The humans had taken proportionally the heaviest losses, throwing their smaller ships into the most dangerous positions to protect larger vessels, but they had also accomplished something that would echo through history. They had shown the galaxy that diversity was strength, not. 5 years after the Battle of the Galactic Rim, the galaxy was a place that no one would have recognized. Admiral Lee Dong-wook formerly, Captain Lee stood in the memorial garden on New Busan, where the names of the fallen were inscribed in 17 different languages. The planet that had once been a lifeless rock was now a thriving world, where beings from across the galaxy lived and worked together. The memorial itself told the story of what had been won and what had been lost. 3,000 names were carved into crystal monuments that reflected light in patterns meaningful to different species. Human names stood beside Keelan designations. Vorthak atmospheric signatures were etched next to Nexari quantum frequencies. Every being who had died in the final battle was remembered in their own cultural tradition. Dr. Park Jin-woo joined Lee at the memorial, carrying reports about the latest developments across the galaxy. Trade routes that had been closed for centuries were carrying cargo between worlds that had once been bitter enemies. Scientific research stations welcomed scholars from species that had spent generations trying to kill each other. Cultural exchange programs brought together young beings who saw diversity as natural rather than threatening. The transformation had not been easy or automatic. In the immediate aftermath of victory, old suspicions and centuries of hatred did not simply disappear. High Regent Vex Tal and War Marshal Kryn had both struggled to convince their people that former enemies could become trusted partners. Many worlds remained isolated by choice, preferring familiar isolation to uncertain cooperation. The breakthrough had come when refugee populations who had lived and worked with humans during the post-war period began returning to their reconstructed homeworlds. They carried with them not just stories about cooperation, but practical experience in making it work. Mixed communities that had formed around human aid stations became models for integration that other worlds could follow. Engineer Baymin Siak had spent 3 years helping to rebuild the Keelan industrial worlds that had been strip-mined during the Great War. His teams included humans, Vorthak atmospheric specialists, and even former Crimson Federation technicians working together to restore ecosystems that had been thought permanently destroyed. The success of these projects proved that cooperation could accomplish what no single species could achieve alone. The new Galactic Assembly met in rotating locations rather than maintaining a fixed capital. The old system of permanent seats for major powers had been replaced by representation based on contribution to common project. Species that helped with disaster relief got more votes than those that focused only on their own interests. The humans, despite having the smallest territory, held influence far beyond their numbers because of their consistent focus on galactic rather than local concerns. Commander Kang Soo-bin now served as the assembly coordinator, helping to manage debates between beings whose ways of thinking were fundamentally different. The job required patience, understanding, and the ability to find common ground between perspectives that seemed completely incompatible. Her success had made her one of the most respected figures in galactic politics. The economic changes were as dramatic as the political ones. Trade agreements based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation had created prosperity that spread across multiple star systems. The Zephyr Empire had shared their crystal technology in exchange for crimson biomechanical expertise. Both civilizations were stronger than they had been even before the Great War began. Dr. Choi So-young established the Galactic Cultural Institute on New Busan, where young beings from different species learned about each other's histories, traditions, and ways of thinking. The institute had become so popular that admission was competitive with thousands of applicants for every available position. Students who graduated from the program carried understanding and respect back to their home worlds. The military changes were perhaps the most significant. Of all the separate fleets that had fought the Great War, were being gradually replaced by integrated forces, where mixed crews were standard rather than experimental ships, designed by multiple species, combined the best features of different technologies, creating vessels more capable than anything any single civilization had ever built. Captain Oh Seung-hwan commanded one of the new unified patrol fleets responsible for protecting trade routes and responding to emergencies. His flagship Seoul Harmony carried crew members from 9 different species working together with an efficiency that would have seemed impossible just years before. The sight of such ships had become a symbol of the new galactic order. The challenges were real and ongoing. Despite the victory over the void touched, not everyone in the galaxy was ready to embrace cooperation. Some worlds remained suspicious of the changes, preferring the predictable hostilities of the old system to the uncertain possibilities of the new one. Extremist groups on several worlds advocated for a return to the imperial systems that had dominated before the war. The separatist movement, led by former military officers from both major empires, argued that the new cooperative system was making the galaxy weak and vulnerable. They claimed that diversity was being forced on unwilling populations and that traditional values were being destroyed in the name of unity. Their message found support among beings who felt overwhelmed by the pace of change. Ambassador Kim Tae-hyun worked tirelessly to address these concerns through diplomatic channels rather than force. The human approach remained consistent even when dealing with groups that openly opposed galactic unity. Violence would only prove the separatists right about the dangers of cooperation. The solution had to come through demonstration rather than domination. The test of the new system came when long-range sensors detected another threat approaching from a different direction. The Devourers were an ancient machine intelligence that consumed entire star systems to fuel their expansion. They had been dormant for millennia, but were now moving toward the galaxy with clear hostile intent. The response to this new threat showed how much had changed in 5 years. Instead of panicking or fragmenting into competing factions, the galactic community came together with remarkable speed. The Assembly voted unanimously to coordinate defense preparations, while individual species volunteered resources and expertise without being asked. Admiral Park Kyung-soo took command of the Unified Response Fleet, which included vessels from every major civilization and many smaller ones. The integration that had been experimental during the void-touched crisis was now standard procedure. Mixed crews trained together as routine rather than emergency measure. The Devourer fleet was different from previous enemies. These were pure machines with no biological components to disrupt, but the lessons learned from fighting the void-touched proved applicable. Diverse tactics and unpredictable coordination created problems that even advanced artificial intelligence could not solve effectively. Lieutenant Colonel Yang Seo-jin led the reconnaissance missions that identified Devourer weaknesses. The machine intelligence was incredibly advanced, but it was also rigid, following predetermined patterns that could be predicted and countered. The key was to force the enemy into situations where their programming could not provide effective responses. The Battle of the Outer Markers lasted only 3 days, but it demonstrated the transformation of galactic military capabilities. The unified fleet fought with coordination that surpassed even the best achievements against the void-touched ships from different species, supported each other instinctively. Crews anticipated each other's needs without conscious thought. Engineer Chief Kwon Dong-hyun discovered that Devourer machines could be confused by quantum interference patterns generated by Nexari communication systems. Combined with Zephyr crystal resonance technology and Vorthak atmospheric manipulation, the effect created cascading system failures throughout the enemy fleet. The victory was complete and decisive, but more importantly, It was achieved without the desperate sacrifices that had marked the previous war. The galaxy had learned to fight together effectively enough that superior coordination could overcome superior technology. The machine intelligence retreated after recognizing that conquest was impossible. In the aftermath of the second victory, the remaining opposition to galactic unity largely collapsed. Even the most stubborn separatists had to admit that cooperation worked better than competition. The old empires had never been able to defeat threats like the Void Touched or the Devourers, but the unified galaxy had done so twice. Dr. Song Min Ho established medical research programs that combined knowledge from every known species. Diseases that had plagued individual civilizations for millennia were being cured through techniques that no single species could have developed alone. Life expectancy was increasing across the galaxy while infant mortality dropped to historical lows. The cultural flowering that followed the military victories was unprecedented. Art forms that combined traditions from multiple species created beauty that no one had imagined possible. Music that blended different species. Aesthetic sensibilities moved listeners in ways that purely traditional compositions never could. Young beings growing up in the new galaxy took cooperation for granted in ways that amazed their elders. Children who played together without noticing species differences were becoming adults who saw diversity as normal, rather than threatening. The psychological barriers that had maintained SEPA